We are fortunate to have as a speaker today someone who has worked in the area of minorities and intergroup relations. He has recently completed a book in which he attempted to synthesize what we know about the relations between members of majority and minority groups. His book, They and We, Racial and Ethnic Relations in the United States, was published by Random House earlier this year. He was the editor of the Research Bulletin of Intergroup Relations from 1959 to 63, and is the new chairman of the Committee of Intergroup Relations in the Society for the Study of Social Problems. He was also co-editor of a special issue of Social Problems entitled The Threat of War. Currently, he teaches sociology and anthropology at Smith College and at the University of Massachusetts. I'm very pleased to present Professor Peter Rose.
On two occasions during the past year, once in Los Angeles last summer, and again in Boston last spring, I was asked to help draft statements expressing the sentiments of social scientists on the Civil Rights Bill as it was being maneuvered through Congress. Gathered together for annual meetings of these societies, sociologists felt it necessary to indicate not only their support for the bill, but also the reason for their decision to speak officially on public issues, and this is something that sociologists are rather wont to do. As scientists, then, not as politicians, as researchers, not as social engineers, last August, the members of the so-called SSSP, the Society for the Study of Social Problems, unanimously approved a strong resolution supporting the Civil Rights Bill and sent it to the late President Kennedy and every member of the United States Congress. About 3 months ago, the members of the Eastern Sociological Society endorsed a similar statement. We mailed this to President Johnson and to all the members of the Senate. And the statements, incidentally, were used in the debates themselves. They were entered in the congressional record, and not merely in a perfunctory manner. And I brought with me, well, that sounds very McCarthy-ish. I can really show it to you. I brought with me a statement that I just received the other day, which is even more exciting than the two minor coups we pulled off. The Southern Sociological Society unanimously approved a similar kind of statement. Now, the resolutions of which I speak are similar in content, if not in form. And I want to quote to you from one of them. Quote, "The denial of full rights to Negroes and other minority groups is America's most serious social problem. Overwhelming evidence indicates that segregation and other forms of discrimination, whether private or public, are psychologically, economically, and socially detrimental to those who are deprived. They are detrimental to society as a whole." And these sociologists went on to say, and I continue the quote, "The effect of racial discrimination contributes to the initiation and perpetuation of many other social problems." And the sociologists encourage the passage of the bill as one of a number of means to begin to turn the tide. And notice I say only one of a number of means, lest, and again I quote, "dislocation and strife be the fate of America." Now, I think that these short, terse sentences, in a sense, are a summary of what anyone could say on the social consequences of discrimination. For while it's true that segregation and its consequence is a complex story, the ending of that story is brutally simple. Discrimination is psychologically, economically, and socially damaging to those who are excluded and deprived. It is damaging to their children and to their children's children. The malaise of most of the poor in the United States, that so-called 1/5 of the population about whom we've heard so much recently, is intimately, though not exclusively, connected to patterns of segregation which exist in this country. For non-whites, and I include here Puerto Ricans and Indians, Mexican Americans, as well as Negros, segregation is not merely a residential phenomenon. It extends beyond the reservations, beyond the barrios, beyond the ghettos, and it reaches into every nook and cranny of daily life. Its effect isn't difficult to assess. You people all know this. One doesn't have to be a sociologist to see that the gray areas of our great cities, those sandwiched between the better residential sections and the commercial districts, and the brown areas of the rural sections, are blighted by deprivation and despair. And although the term is out of fashion, the people who live in these areas are, in a very real sense, marginal men. Those who Herbert Bloomer, who I guess is one of the few locals in the area, Herbert Bloomer has said, are both beyond and below those who belong to the dominant group. And it is true, I think, that even at the city's center, these people remain, or at least have remained, on the metaphoric margin. They are marginal men. Before I discuss any specific consequences of discrimination in America, and especially reactions to it, let me say a very few words about possible causes. This is very dangerous, and you should have several lectures just talk about possible causes of discriminatory behavior. There have been many attempts to explain it. One popular view suggests that discrimination is simply an extreme form of exploitation. Keeping a whole category of persons down is an efficient and profitable way of maintaining a cheap labor supply. And indeed, as John Hope Franklin says in his book, as Stanley Elkins says in Slavery, and probably said here, Negroes were brought to these shores as a cheap source of labor for Southern planters, not because they wanted to torment Africans, though torment and torture them they did. Another theory of discrimination suggests that people get psychological satisfaction from discrimination. One's ego is inflated by the sense of superiority he feels toward those who are weaker. A third explanation leans toward the notion that discrimination is based on the wariness of the unknown, on an ethnocentric fear of the strange, of the different. And there is another view that discrimination is a response to a real, rather than an imagined threat. We hear this particularly today in some of the industrializing areas of the South. In actual fact, I would contend that it's highly probable that these disparate theories, economic exploitation, psychological satisfaction, ethnocentrism, and fear of competition are closely related, because there are advantages accruing to people who discriminate. John Dollard made this very clear in his famous study, Caste and Class in a Southern Town. And in his analysis, I think it's interesting to point out, in Dollard's analysis, that so-called Marxian and so-called Freudian interpretations are joined. As he shows, for people who are in superordinate positions, the rewards can be both material and psychological. At any rate, discrimination exists at bottom because there are advantages in maintaining it. It persists, I think, for another reason as well, inertia. And that, by inertia, I mean the comfort one feels with what he knows, and the support one gets from seeing others behave and think similarly. I'm always reminded of the fact that when plebiscites were held during the German era, the Nazis sometimes got as high as 98% support. This means that it's difficult to overcome, and it's becoming increasingly clear that the voices of sweet reason and the voices of exhortation from the pulpits have seldom helped reduce the prejudices and the discriminatory patterns, that successes have only come when situations are redefined. Or to put it more bluntly, when once appropriate behavior is made inappropriate, when discrimination is deemed wrong. And I think there's sufficient evidence gathered by social scientists to indicate that behavior rises to meet expectations, and when expectations change, so does behavior. And thus, I don't think it's inconceivable that even those Southern whites, and Northern ones too, who feel they have much to lose through integration, may go along with changes wrought by strong legislation and, more importantly, assiduous enforcement. I don't expect they'll like it, but perhaps that's not what's important initially. An English judge eloquently made the distinction between prejudice as an attitude toward a group of people and the kind of discrimination I've been talking about here. His comment pertained to the riots, the Notting Hill riots of several years ago, and was directed at 9 men convicted of race rioting. And he said, and I quote, "Everyone, irrespective of the color of his skin, is entitled to walk through our streets in peace and with his head held high and free from fear. These courts will uphold these rights. Think what you like, but once you translate your dark thoughts into savage acts, the law will punish you and protect your victim." I think the implication here is one which I personally support, that one must attack the normative system first. And this is why I began by talking about the the riots, the Notting Hill riots of several years ago, and was directed at 9 men convicted of race rioting. And he said, and I quote, "Everyone, irrespective of the color of his skin, is entitled to walk through our streets in peace and with his head held high and free from fear. These courts will uphold these rights. Think what you like, but once you translate your dark thoughts into savage acts, the law will punish you and protect your victim." I think the implication here is one which I personally support, that one must attack the normative system first. And this is why I began by talking about the Civil Rights Bill and what I see as its major significance, although I don't see that it's the end-all or the be-all today, although today may be the day it passes. The fact of the matter is that discrimination continues, and that so far the changes have been relatively few and far between. And even if the bill passes today or tomorrow, as it well might, this is but one little step, I think, in the whole process of changing the normative patterns. Now, to turn to a slightly different point, but related, let me say that the long history of the Negro in America is a story of social deprecation, of psychological deprivation. I don't think I have to recount that history here. I presume you've been hearing it all week and reading about it in your text. But I want to remind you of just several points. One is the fact that from slavery to the present, from slavery and the period of the Middle Passage to the very present, few Negroes have ever enjoyed anything approximating the freedoms which whites take for granted. I don't mean changes have not occurred. Of course they have. Slavery was abolished in what Elkins has called the first emancipation. And for a time it seemed as if Negroes would no longer have to play the parasitic roles demanded by their white masters and by the black codes. A civil rights bill was passed in Congress a long time ago. It was passed in 1866 and it was signed by the first President Johnson. In 1867, 1 million Negroes were enfranchised. And yet we must not forget the temper of the times, the tensions, the political climate. Radical Reconstruction couldn't last, and it didn't. And a new era emerged with the birth of widespread resistance, officially beginning with Hayes's Compromise of 1877. I might digress for a moment to say that a recent issue of Ebony, which I read, voted or discussed the president who helped the Negro the least, and Rutherford B. Hayes got the unanimous vote. Federal troops were withdrawn from the South, and it wasn't long before the emancipated slave was disenfranchised first and then reduced to secondary status in a world marked by the unequal separation of almost all social institutions. And we know that this was legally sanctified by the United States Supreme Court in the famous Plessy case of 1896. At the time of Plessy-Ferguson, 9 out of 10 Negroes lived in the South, 80% of them in rural areas. And while de facto segregation existed in the states outside the old Confederacy, it was in the South that the Negro suffered most. Well, one must remember that Europe's refugees were flocking to the eastern seaboard and to the northern cities. But Negroes didn't begin their mass migration northward until the European influx was slowed or curtailed by the First World War. And then between 1910 and 1920, 500,000 Negroes moved to northern cities. And here they settled in tenement districts, forming black islands in a sea dominated by people more foreign and yet less alien to the city than they themselves. And they stayed. The city became their home, and the ghetto became their jail. The end of the war didn't bring about the reverse migration. For poor as it was, the North seemed somehow better, somehow more palatable. In the South, the devil had always been the white man with the lynch rope. But now, with veterans returning with all-American sentiments at an all-time high, all-American in italics, Negroes in the North found themselves isolated, alone, under attack wherever they dared cross the barriers established by whites, the barriers of segregation. In the summer of 1917, for example, 100 Negroes died in St. Louis in race riots. In 1919, bloody race rioting occurred in Chicago after a Negro boy swam into a so-called white area in Lake Michigan. That was the summer that some of you historians will remember as referred to by James Weldon Johnson as the Red Summer. The competition continued, and Negroes were given the least desirable jobs when they were given jobs at all. And I think it's no wonder that the caricature of the Southern Sambo was transformed into a Northern Step and Fetch It. The darky was seen as the darky, in quotes, was seen as a domestic servant, or an elevator boy, or a petty thief, or a con artist, or a pimp. And these are very often the things he had to be in order to survive. And then when the Depression hit, it hit everyone. But those who were traditionally the last hired and the first to be let go suffered most. And so quite understandably did domestic laborers, the luxury of the wealthier classes. And in both instances, Negroes numbered very high. And then came the next war. Northward migration increased again, and so did the western migration. First it came in a stream, and the stream increased to a torrent. And Negroes began to find jobs in defense plants and earned higher wages than those they'd ever known before. At least 1 million Negroes entered the armed forces during the Second World War. But even during that time, and I think it's curious, that particular war, Negroes found themselves in segregated units of the Army and in specialized branches of the Navy, usually as stewards. And it's a fact the military was not ordered integrated until 1948, 3 years after the end of World War II. And it's also true that the order was not implemented until 1952, during the Korean War, by President Eisenhower, who himself had fought against this ordinance several years earlier. Negroes in the North and in the South shared in the economic boom of the post-war era. But while the absolute gains they made were sometimes considerable, the gap between the white and colored communities remained as wide as ever. Negroes in the North and in the South took pride in the emergence of Africa. Many thought that independence movements there might help set them free too. It didn't. And most important, I think, was the Supreme Court decision of 1954, which overturned Plessy and gave new hope that segregation, now ruled illegal, would force the white community to move with all deliberate speed. As we know too well, only token measures were taken. And Negroes continued to be second class. In name, but more tragically in fact. For the record, let me give you some statistics. Sociologists are supposed to report statistics, so I thought I would give you some differences wrought directly or indirectly by segregation and its legacy. Some facts which demonstrate the extent to which color matters and what it means to be black in America. The United States, as you probably don't have to be told, is a racially dichotomous society. I mention this because in most of the other Americas, we have what I would call a racially continuous society, where there are gradations, and these gradations make a difference. But in this society, we separate people into arbitrary social categories, not into anthropological subgroups. I have a friend who teaches here at Berkeley, an anthropologist, who was stationed in Montgomery, Alabama, and was in 1957, I believe, one of the only white members of the NAACP there. And he once wrote an editorial to the newspaper in which he said, if you were really serious about this color business, you should put anthropological tiles along the seats in the buses, and then people could match their skin color against this and be consistent. But this isn't the way it works here. Anyone who has a trace of Negro ancestry is ipso facto Negro. And the extent to which this categorization is officially sanctioned is an evidence of the census definition of Negro. It reads, in addition to people who are called Negro, persons of Negro ancestry and of mixed Negro and white descent. These are categorized as Negro. And it goes on to say that it includes, quote, people of mixed American, Indian, and Negro descent, unless the Indian ancestry very definitely predominates, or unless the individual is regarded as an Indian in the community. Bruton Berry published a book recently in which he described those people of mixed racial parentage who call themselves Indians. And in the book, he indicates that recognizing the stigma of being a Negro as being worse today, at any rate, than being an Indian. He said one man told him that it's better to be red than black, even an off shade of red. But very, very few people are able to join the Indian or white world, and most Americans with Negro ancestry cannot. In any case, according to these crude indices, the 1962 census figures indicate that there were approximately 165 million whites in the United States, 21.5 million Negroes, and 1.5 million Americans classified as members of other races, and this includes American Indians. Negroes were around 10% of the total, and 94% of the non-white category. I mention the latter fact because the breakdowns I'm going to give you, just very few of them, compare whites to non-whites. They don't separate Negroes out. But 94% of these non-whites are Negroes. Here are some random statistics. In 1960, white males had a life expectancy at the time of birth of 67 years. Non-white males, 61. Females who were white could expect to live 74 years. Non-white women, 66. Infant mortality in 1961 was twice as high for non-white babies, both male and female, as it was for whites. Maternal mortality was approximately 25 deaths per 100,000 live births for whites, and 4 times that for non-white mothers in 1961. And I must point out that in these instances we're talking about registered deaths. The discrepancy is probably greater in actuality. I use these particular familial type statistics for a particular reason, because family problems, I think, are indeed a basic part of the total picture, and they extend far beyond differential rates of fertility or mortality. In a recent volume called Mental Health and Segregation, Martin Grossack, a psychologist, contends that 20% of Negroes have disrupted families with only one parent present. I think the figure might even be higher. And thus he suggests that at least in 1 in 5 of these families, the family is dominated by mothers or grandmothers. Fathers are frequently unemployed and unemployable, as I'll point out in a few minutes, and thus are poor providers. Desertion sometimes seems the best way out of this rather intolerable situation. And one of the many results of the situation is the fact that mothers, who are frequently more employable than fathers, go out and work, leaving children to care for one another. But another equally serious result is the frequent preference on the part of women for their female children, and the rejection of male youngsters who are already confused by the female world in which they live, and in which there are no adequate male role models. Many of these children, especially the boys here, become drifters, children who avoid home, children who avoid school. Crippled by rejection, they very frequently find learning difficult, and they give up when they're very, very young. Now, in addition to those who have difficulty learning to read, as many of these children do, and we've talked a great deal recently about providing compensatory services, particularly in the learning of verbal skills for deprived children. In addition to these, we find that 7.5% of all non-white children, compared to 1.5% of whites over the age of 14, were found illiterate in the 1960 census reports. And on schooling, I can give you some figures if you want to write them down, and then I'll give very few more statistics. This is from the 60 census. The census shows that the median number of school years completed for whites 25 years of age or older was 10.9. For non-whites, it was 8.2. Half, 50% of the non-whites had 7 years or less schooling, compared to 1 in 5, or 20% of the whites. 1/3 of the non-whites had attended high school, though only 14% completed it. For whites, 45% attended high school, and 25% graduated, 10% more than the non-whites. Finally, 8% of the non-whites had gone to college, including 3.5% who went for 4 years or more. 17.5% of the whites attended, and 8% graduated and/or went on. Now, I haven't distinguished here in any of these figures between northern and southern, rural, urban, segregated, and integrated schools or areas. However, since most Negroes still continue to live in the so-called Black Belt, let me cite some findings from the 1961 Civil Rights Report regarding segregated schooling. 7 years after the Supreme Court decision, and now it's 10, only 775 of almost 3,000 biracial school districts in 17 southern states that required racial segregation in the public schools on that date, May 17, 1954, had taken any action to abolish racial segregation. In many of the school districts, some start had been made, but actual desegregation was minimal when the 61 report was written and is minimal today. The figures have not changed very much in the last 3 years. They've changed, but not much. There's token integration, but not a great deal of that. Moreover, and not to be overlooked, is the fact that de facto segregation exists in northern and western schools as well, and that this is, of course, intimately tied to the patterns of residential segregation. Here in the Bay Area, and I'm a stranger telling you about your area, a report by Wilson Record, who will speak here next week, I understand, indicates that in the small print of the 1960 census, we find the following. Forgive me if I mispronounce the names of your counties. In Contra Costa County, 90% of the Negro population was concentrated in 8% of the census tracts. Half of the Negro population lives in 3 census tracts, 1/4 in a single tract, covering extremely substandard area, an area known as North Richmond. Record cites evidence showing the same pattern in San Mateo and other Bay Area counties, and the extent to which residential segregation is a reality, and the extent to which residential segregation is a reality, he points out that in a report submitted to the official Marin County Committee on Discrimination in 1959, it was said, quote, responsible qualified Negroes and Orientals who attempted to rent or buy houses from 37 active real estate and building firms in the county were in all but 3 cases refused. And examples of this don't have to be drawn from the Bay Area. We can find them in reports of Los Angeles and Chicago and New York and Boston and Baltimore. Institutionalized segregation in housing is widespread, and the sentiments of whites are quite clear. They were made very clear in the Lewis Harris poll last summer. He found that 51% of whites all over the country would object to having a Negro family as a next-door neighbor. You might wonder what the difference was in the South. It was 74% in the South. On the other hand, and to shift gears for a moment, according to that same poll, a mere 17% said they would object to working with Negroes on the job. And yet here, as in housing, discrimination continues apace. But the job market, I think, is even more complex and points back to the more basic problems. When deprived of decent care, when raised frequently in broken homes, when given inferior or inadequate schooling, and these two things are not always the same, when driven into the streets or into the fields at a very early age, many Negroes are relegated to the ranks of the unemployable, even though they would welcome work were they skilled enough to perform it or well enough trained to perform it. And thus recent figures indicate that approximately 1 in 9 Negro males are unemployed. What does all this mean? What are all these facts and figures? What am I really telling you? Many of you who I understand know the figures better than I do. It means that in category after category, Negroes and whites are different. Not physically different, but socially different and economically different. And sadly, despite the nice sentiments mouthed in the classrooms across the land, the words that tell us that everyone has a great place in this great nation of ours, that any man can be anything if he tries hard enough, that this is a truly free society. Sadly, as I said, these patriotic sentiments and phrases are, for many Americans, simply abstract words with little meaning. For Negroes in this country, at least for most Negroes, these words apply to them, not us. As Charles Silberman says so bluntly in Crisis in Black and White, a recent bombshell that Random House published. He said, what we are discovering in the United States is that all of it, north as well as south, west as well as east, is a racist society. A racist society in a sense and to a degree that we have refused to admit, much less face. Color does matter, and the United States has made it matter. For many years, certain historians and some sociologists have suggested that the urbanization of the Negro was simply another case of immigrant adjustment in the tide of urban growth. With acculturation, they argued, Negroes, like others before them, would find their niche, would begin climbing the ladder. And other people, not social scientists, other people less scholarly, have suggested, and you've all heard these things expressed in your communities, I'm sure, occasionally, indeed frequently, with self-righteous indignation, that no other minority groups ever received so much attention as that given to Negroes and Puerto Ricans. And some say that they themselves had to fight their way out of the East Side, or out of the South Side, or out of some other notorious tenement district by their own efforts, without the aid of special services, without the aid of special schools, without the aid of special agencies. And many point out that in the old days, only hope and a belief in the American dream were needed to spur them on. For many Irish and Italian and Polish and Jewish Americans, these things are true. It's true. But what's also true is that opportunities for Europe's immigrants, even those desperately poor, were always far greater than those ever afforded colored people, and especially Negroes. The economist, the Harvard economist, John Kenneth Galbraith, is reported to have quipped recently, if you have to be poor, at least have the good sense to be born at a time when everybody's poor. Now, I want to change this being born to being entering the urban economy, because this is only part of the problem. Not only are Negroes entering the urban economy at the wrong time, according to the Galbraith dictum, but unlike most other minorities, they have rarely, very rarely in the past, been able to establish a sense of community, a fellow feeling, which could serve to strengthen in-group ties, which could provide a sense of positive rather than negative identity, a sense of cohesiveness, an esprit de corps, which would aid Negroes in preparing them for concerted action to upset the status quo. The reasons for this are manifold, and of course they're tied directly to Negro history in this country. I can't go into the whole thing, but let me make some remarks on this. Suffices to say that Negroes discriminated against at every turn have by and large lacked the opportunities to form organizations and institutions which could generate a groundswell of popular political activity. And throughout the long and bitter history of the Negro in this country, there have only been fleeting moments when they have taken pride in their racial heritage, and very often spuriously at that, and fleeting instances of revolt. I don't mean to play down Nat Turner, slave revolts, or anything else. But these are relatively minor in the whole history of the Negro community. There have been exceptions, yes, but I cannot overemphasize the fact that by and large, for many, and maybe most Negroes whose homes are in the ghettos of the North or West, or in the so-called quarters of the South, unlike the immigrants against whom they are invariably and unfortunately compared, failure, not hope, has been the prevailing modus vivendi. This is a very important point I wish to make today. The theme of failure rather than the theme of hope, which has pervaded many of the areas in which Negroes have lived. And the outside world, the world of the majority, and to a considerable extent the world of other minorities, has hardly helped to exacerbate the situation. And thus, for many decades, the general condition has been one in which the majority of Negroes felt themselves trapped into a corner out of which there seemed little room to maneuver. They couldn't help themselves or each other, nor it seemed could anybody else. There has always been this problem of low status reinforcing a negative self-concept. And until recently, only certain avenues seemed open to those discriminated against. And these avenues, or alternatives, are the things I wish to dwell on in the time remaining. That was a very long introduction. Sorry. In my own work recently, I've found it convenient to discuss the Negro's self-image and his reaction to discrimination in terms of a simple typology. And I don't mean to use this typology to dehumanize or, as one of my non-sociological colleagues says, to sociologize the issues, but an attempt to clarify them. The typology, which I'll put on the board for you, is based on two very simple questions. Number one, does he, the Negro, or any minority member, accept or reject the image of subordinate status imposed upon him? I'll repeat the question. Does he, that is, the Negro, accept or does he reject the image of subordinate status imposed upon him? In other words, does he see himself as others see him? And secondly, is he willing to play the segregated role as expected of him by the members of the majority group? For years, indeed since segregation replaced the pattern of slavery, many Negroes have reacted to discrimination by accepting inferior status and by playing inferior roles, or segregated roles. American folklore is filled with stories of Uncle Toms and Aunt Jemimas, the handkerchief heads, who bowed and scraped and cracked jokes and played dumb just to please the white folks. And tragically, as we all know, Uncle Toms exist in real life too. There have always been those who believe that the best way to live is to accept second-class status and do the white man's bidding. In the eyes of the Southern whites, Uncle Tom has always been the person who knew the score and could play the tune as well. Many of you will remember the pitiful portrayal of submission by Shorty, the elevator operator, in Richard Wright's powerful autobiography, Black Boy. Shorty did do anything to gain the favor of the white man. He stooped, if you remember that passage, literally, not figuratively, to permit a white man to give him a vicious kick in order to win the quarter he coveted so. Now, some people have interpreted Shorty's playing the role of buffoon as clever manipulation. After all, he got what he wanted. He got his quarter. And yet his behavior also indicates the depth of his submissiveness, for he played the game according to the white man's rules. Now, for some, indeed for most, this kind of acceptance of subordinate status is viewed as the only way to eke out a living, or perhaps to live at all. The most unfortunate consequence of even pragmatic acceptance of submission is the fact that as one writer put it, quote, people can learn to adjust to and even accept extremely diverse circumstances that seem strange, painful, or evil to those who have received different training. Standards of value by which the desirability of a given status is judged, as well as the status itself, are a product of society, end quote. Thus, for some individuals, acceptance of such inferior roles is simply conformity to the traditions of the community in which one happens to be raised. And thus, as many whites learn that they are superior to Negroes as part of a more general socialization experience, Negroes, at least some Negroes, have accepted the standards of racial inferiority. And for these, the acceptance of inferior status may be viewed, in my mind, as a conditioned reaction in a prejudiced society that is normal, not abnormal. As society changes, and society is changing, the numbers of those who play at Uncle Tom and the number of those who are Uncle Toms, and there is a difference, is rapidly diminishing. This pattern of acquiescence or submission is but one type of reaction to discrimination. A second type, in the second cell, is the denial of identity, or the patterns of total or partial assimilation, in quotes. In this case, as in the first, the individual accepts the majority's image of his group, and because of self-hatred, or expediency, or perhaps both, he withdraws from his group. He seeks absorption by the majority. For some people, passing is then the modus operandi, but this course is open only to those who lack identifying racial characteristics, or those who can skillfully mask them. For others, special skills or talents must supersede color as a condition for acceptance. Sometimes Negroes who become expatriates or entertainers or engage in such illicit activities as gambling and prostitution gain admittance into the world of whites. Some are thus accepted in spite of their race. But to put it bluntly, in too many cases, when such a person steps out of his specialized role, he's just another nigger. It wasn't so long ago that Negro college students at Ivy League schools in the East, Northeast I'm talking about, feared the day he would graduate and return to the world of discrimination and hostility. And even today, in many parts of the South and West, the Negro soldier is reluctant to leave his army post. He knows full well what to expect beyond the gates. Fortunately, submission and attempted assimilation are gradually becoming relics of the past. For a variety of reasons, we're beginning to see the end of accommodation. We're seeing the beginning of the end, I think, of passing. Now let me spend the rest of the time talking about the last two types of reaction. Those utilized by Negroes who reject the idea that they are inferior. Those who attempt to destroy the myth of Sambo, or of the happy nigger, or of the noble savage, or of the shiftless watermelon-eating darky, or I might add, of innate athletic prowess, or of rhythm, or of sensuality. Before the war, Hortense Powdermaker wrote a book called After Freedom, in which she pointed to the fact that many Negroes who had risen to relatively high status positions in their own segregated world were most resentful of those who submitted to the indignities imposed by whites, the ones on the other side of the line. Decrying the loose morality and ignorance by which they felt the lower-class Negro lent credence to unfair notions about their race, these members of the new black bourgeoisie set up their own society. Some, and especially Franklin Fraser, called it a sham society, an escape into a world of make-believe. Others argued that this kind of avoidance, and I would call that cell the avoidance cell, avoidance and separatism, is a typical response of any upwardly mobile minority group. And yet, as I mentioned earlier, there's always been something unique about the Negro segment of the population compared with other American minorities. And though some would disagree, vehemently I think that Negroes have long been a social category without a culture of their own, have been a group without an ethnic identity. In the United States, the Negro's history is so intimately tied into the world of whites that until recently, even the so-called Negro institutions have been blackface parodies of the white world. And I'm talking about things in addition to the skin whiteners and the hair straighteners advertised in the Negro slicks in ebony and jet and tan. The whole world of the black bourgeoisie is riddled with the preeminence of white middle-class standards. A colleague of mine who recently read that highly charged article by Norman Podhoretz, My Negro Problem and Ours, in commentary said, "I never knew his kind of Negroes. My kind were so goddamn proper it was embarrassing. And they weren't Uncle Tommy neither. They were decent, upright, very pious, almost puritanical." Now, people like these have for many years been seen as models for little Negro children to seek to emulate. And some would say that Booker T. Washington would have loved them and said they do us proud. But most of them came into their own, as it were, between 110th Street and Lenox Hill, or on the South Side, if you know these reference points. That is, within the ghetto. They've rejected inferior status. They've gotten mighty high, as the saying goes, but not too close. They've complied with voluntary segregation, and what I would term a conventional response to separate treatment have played a segregated and separated role. I say conventional response because that third cell has two categories, one conventional and one radical patterns of avoidance. But before I do that, let me parenthetically say a word about Booker T. Washington, who's gotten attacked from all sides in recent years by historians and sociologists. As far back as the beginning of the century, the now largely discredited Washington sought to come to terms with a basic problem. He was operating in a Southern context, and he was a Southern Negro. He saw the hope of the Negro, at least those in the Southland, in a land of deep-rooted segregation, in terms of the development of pride and self-esteem, and in the Puritan values of thrift and practicality, in the learning of skills of the honest tradesman. His famous speech to Atlanta in 1895 has been interpreted as clear capitulation to separation, even to accommodation and acquiescence. In a sense, I guess it was. The implication was clear. Negroes were not ready, according to that speech, to take their place besides whites. At least this is what the argument mounted by Washington's critics. Yet Washington never condoned discrimination, and in fact, in December 1915, in a posthumous letter which was published in the New Republic, some of you might look at this, Washington stated his firm opposition to segregation itself. What he and others saw, and perhaps only now can we begin to take a second look, was not Uncle Tomism, as his most extreme critics claimed and continue to claim, but a kind of pluralism, an acceptance not of inferior status, but of separate roles. In his most famous address, later called the Atlanta Compromise, he did of course say, and I quote, "The wisest among my race understand that the agitation of questions of social equality is the extremest folly." That was the loaded line. "And that progress in the enjoyment of all the privileges that will come to us must be the result of severe and constant struggle rather than artificial forcing." He also said it is important and right that all privileges of the law be ours, but it is vastly more important that we be prepared for the exercise of these privileges. And then in the most quoted phrase of the famous speech, he said, "In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet as one in the hand, in all things essential to mutual progress." Now, in a recent volume, sociologist Milton Gordon has suggested that behavioral assimilation, similar to what Washington said, and what I would call social separation or structural pluralism, Gordon's term is structural pluralism, is the pattern of life which has prevailed in American history, not Anglo-conformity nor the romantic melting pot. And in a masterful study of 5 of New York City's major ethnic groups, Nathan Glazer and Daniel Moynihan give empirical evidence to support this same thesis. What I'm saying here, and opening, I suppose, a Pandora's box, is that Washington wasn't entirely wrong, although I disagree fundamentally, personally, with the kind of position he took. At least he seems to have understood half of the problem of self, the problem of community. At Tuskegee Institute, the Southern Washington saw it and succeeded to some extent in implementing his plan for uplift. And for a time he became the Negro's idol. And to this day he remains a symbol for many whites, especially too many school teachers, of the responsible and reasonable Negro. Today, few Negroes share these sentiments. In fact, to his most embittered critics, his pleas for the learning of trades and in taking pride in being a Negro are merely masks for the acceptance of inferiority. And no one denounced Washington more bitterly than W.E.B. Du Bois, the founder of the NAACP. Du Bois felt that Washington had misplaced the responsibility for making amends and for bringing about a redress of the Negro's grievances. Segregation was not the Negro's problem, claimed the early members of the NAACP. It was the white man's. Separation in any form was seen as appeasement, and the alternative of protest was offered. The story of the NAACP is interesting, but I think I'll leave that to Wilson Record next week, who knows much more about it than I do. What is significant for our discussion is the apparent bifurcation of the theses for improving the lot of the American Negro. One in the tradition of Washington emphasized separation and self-help. The other, begun by Du Bois, though he himself changed his approach several times, stressed integration and civil rights. And despite their personal animosity, the two men were not as far apart as those movements which followed in their wake. From the beginning of the century, the two themes constantly played against one another, each vying for the support of the Negro masses, and neither ever generating enough to bring about the dramatic changes within or outside the Negro community, changes sufficient to break the backbone of segregation. Until very recently, most Negroes remained too intimidated to act, and whites too recalcitrant to bring the changes, or more importantly, and probably more accurately, too oblivious to care. Professor Howard Bratz has suggested that Washington's theme of accommodation turned toward one of separation, as the Negroes, especially lower-class Negroes, joined the ranks of the Garvey movement in the 1920s. An interesting link between Washington and Garvey, I think. Followed Daddy Grace in the 1930s and joined the black Muslims and other separatist sects more recently. When I talked about the bifurcation before, I meant that it was really moving away from the central theme. And yet each one of these, including the Muslims, was and is a truly uplift organization. It's an old Washington phrase, uplift. The Muslims give a sense of identity to downtrodden followers, a measure of importance, lessons in proper decorum, and above all, a purpose for living. And in this tradition, an increasing number of Negroes, especially those poor and frustrated by the false promises of a northern exposure, have reacted with more radical methods. And we're still in this third cell. They not only maintain separation, but they foster the rejection of white standards. And in this way, they differ from the conventional responders. They proclaim the virtue of blackness and the superiority of Negroes. And as angry as Washington was conciliatory, they seek an identity to call their very own. Until recently, the most famous of these, of course, was the Garvey Back to Africa movement. That reached its peak of influence in the 20s. Garvey's black Zionism made the downtrodden lower-class Negro feel like somebody among white people who said they were nobody. Today, Elijah Muhammad and his Muslims have the same appeal, I think, but with a vengeance. It's very hard to estimate how large the Muslim group is. I've seen figures of 100,000, I've seen figures of 250,000. Depends whose figures you read, theirs or other people's. At any rate, the nationalist movement has great appeal in the urban slums and is gaining converts every day. Its professed aim is the separation of the races and the establishment of a black union. To its critics, of course, it is a black man's Klan. And it's true that it not only stands for racial superiority, but curiously, some members of the Ku Klux Klan have supported the Muslims, particularly in terms of the mutual belief in separation. Not many, incidentally. Others, including George Lincoln Rockwell's Nazis, have applauded its existence, and especially its occasional tirades against the Jews. And it cannot be denied that in northern cities, anti-Semitism runs high among lower-class Negroes. One writer has said, just as society must have a scapegoat, so hatred must have a symbol. Georgia has the Negro, and Harlem has the Jew. But I think the situation is much more complicated. For because of the patterns of ecological change, in many northern cities, Jews are often the white men with whom poor Negroes have the most intimate contact. And it is frequently in situations of real or imagined economic exploitation that they meet. While Mr. Charlie of the South is invariably a Protestant, the man in Harlem may be Jewish. In Boston, he's Irish. In other cities, he's of another ethnic group. On the other hand, I might say, parenthetically, that many of those most active whites in the civil rights movement in the North, and if you read the paper today, in the South, are Jews. And Jewish defense agencies and religious organizations have been at the forefront of intergroup relations for the last half-century. But let's get back to the Muslims. The Muslims are also, of course, anti-Christian, but for a very different reason than those who are anti-Semitic or anti-Semitic. Christianity, it's argued, has sold the Negro a phony bill of goods, the doctrine of brotherhood and equality. Some leaders of the Temple of Islam have come from the ministry itself. Men who said that they suddenly realized one day that the tracts they were passing out really weren't written for them at all. And even aside from religion, for the city Negro in the northern slum, where there's nowhere to go, the Temple of Islam, or the recent non-sectarian Black Nationalist Coalition, is mighty appealing. William Berry, who's executive secretary of the Chicago Urban League, said, quote, "Hell, the Muslims make more sense to the Negro on the street than I do." Whitney Young hasn't said so, but I think he knows it too. And so do many other civil rights leaders. The black Muslims, they call themselves the black Muslims, have a strong case and are pushing it hard. Their appeal, and the degree to which some Negroes are willing to go to express their antagonism toward whites, was, I think, most clearly stated by James Baldwin in James Baldwin's New Yorker piece, which I'm sure all of you have read. Let me just quote from one paragraph from a letter from a region in my mind. Baldwin said, "The brutality with which Negroes are treated in this country simply cannot be overstated, however unwilling white men may be to hear it. In the beginning, a Negro just cannot believe that white people are treating him as they do. he does not know what he's done to merit it. And when he realizes that the treatment accorded him has nothing to do with anything he's done, that the attempt of white people is to destroy him, for that's what it is utterly gratuitous, it's not hard for him to think of white people as devils. Baldwin tried to impress this point on Robert Kennedy at the widely touted meeting in the spring of 1963. He warned of the seething hatred, of the restlessness, of the intensity of bitterness, of the impending danger. And through a secondary source who was with Baldwin last week, he said the Attorney General simply didn't get the message. It's probably true that the white man, any white man, cannot truly fathom what it's like to be a Negro in America. And maybe it's presumptuous of me to speak here. But more important, I think, is the fact that for too long, too many people in too many places have been unwilling to try. And then these very same people in the North and in the South are surprised when the Negro climbs on the Muslim bandwagon and decries the lack of understanding in what he sees to be as no more than the half-hearted support of the liberals, and is shocked when he listens to anyone who says the time is ripe to get the man. Now, there's another group of Negro activists, by far the most significant today, who want equality without any strings. They don't want to be separate and equal. They don't want to be separate and superior, separate and equal in the old sense. They don't want to be separate and superior. They want their equality straight. And they fall within the fourth cell of the typology. I hope I can go into that cell. The real desegregation push has come from the South. And though in the last year or last 2 years it's spread north, compared to the reactionary Muslims, the Southern appeal has, as far as the leadership has been concerned, has been intimately and ultimately connected to a faith in Christian charity, to the notion of universal brotherhood, of integration rather than uplift. And those most prominent at the point of the wedge, being driven into the mores of the Old South, are active leaders of religious congregations. Names you know: King, Abernathy, Shuttlesworth, Williams, others. Their appeal is different from the nationalists, and so are their slogans. They claim that the movement afoot in the South will prove to be the very last attempt made by American Negroes to achieve acceptance, notice the word in italics, acceptance, in the Republic. Will be the very last attempt to force the country to honor its own ideals. Its goal, quote, is nothing less than the liberation of the entire country from its most crippling attitudes and habits. And every day we hear reports of conflict in the South. Dateline, Birmingham, Greensboro, New Orleans, Tuscaloosa, Memphis, Cambridge, Americus, and every day this month, St. Augustine. The most striking thing about these is that perhaps for the first time since the beginning of segregation, the Negro is fighting back relentlessly and winning at almost every turn. Organizations have, of course, played a big role in generating the willingness to protest, to demonstrate, and fight back. Organized protests fostering full integration began with the founding of the NAACP in 1909, and since its inception, the organization has fought for Negro rights primarily, though not exclusively, through its Legal Defense and Education Fund. The NAACP's greatest achievement was the part it played in the Supreme Court decision which 10 years ago, on May 17th, struck down the separate but equal argument. The 1955 decision to order school districts to move with all deliberate speed, and the recent court ruling which proclaimed desegregation must be accelerated. And yet, despite its successful court cases, many Negroes, and some whites too for that matter, have called the NAACP a conservative organization. The main objection is that while effective in lodging complaints and filing suits, it has not pushed hard enough or given support to extra-legal means of protest. And it is true that the speed of action has been less than encouraging. Test cases take a long time to wend their way through the courts, especially since, as you know, they're built on a ladder of costly appeals. But even more significant is the argument that the NAACP has operated in a vacuum. And into this vacuum have come a number of other groups, all of which practice what I would call radical pacifism. Now, this is not passivism with S's. It's passivism with a C. While some preach the ideology of pacifism, almost all practice the strategy of nonviolence. They relentlessly demonstrate in defiance of time-worn customs and against discriminatory codes. This highly controversial movement is thus far proven, in my mind, to be the most effective yet devised for stimulating change and for actually accelerating the process of desegregation. As I told a Smith College assembly last October, the technique is neither new nor is it un-American. It was Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience, as a matter of fact, which laid down the pattern of reaction which provided the model and the essence of today's resistance. If I may digress for a moment, to hear again the words of Thoreau, one is struck by their similarity to the compelling oratory of Martin Luther King. In Thoreau's time, it was slavery and war in Mexico, about which he wrote and protested. Today, there are those who, in Massachusetts, Maryland, even Mississippi, have, like Thoreau, agreed, and I quote him, to pay the price of being men first and subjects afterwards. Those who, feeling they are right, peaceably demonstrate and march and disobey local ordinances and get arrested and go to jail, challenging the very same institutions about which Thoreau wrote, segregation and war. Only he was talking about war in Mexico at that time. There are several organizations which have recently gained recognition as promulgators of the massive demonstrations. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led by the Reverend Martin Luther King, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Congress of Racial Equality, and others. All of them are important, but I'd like to spend a minute talking about CORE, because CORE to me is the most interesting. For it was CORE that was the first to formally advocate the defiance of institutionalized inequality through civil disobedience. CORE was born of pacifism. Today, curiously, those in the peace movement just seem to be discovering the civil rights struggle. And now with the test ban assured, they're joining with fresh, though I must say much belated vigor. In the early 1940s, it was the other way around. When pacifists failed to stem the entry of the United States into the Second World War, and when many of them had second thoughts about nonviolent means of curbing the menace of German racism and the genocidal policies of the Third Reich, they turned their attention to the development of nonviolent techniques to combat racism at home. They took their lessons from the successful teachings of Gandhi, who himself had been so moved by the writings of Thoreau. It was Thoreau who said, we remember, quote, if the law is of such a nature that it requires you to be an agent of injustice to another, then I say break the law. Let your life be a counter-friction to stop the machine. It was Gandhi, you remember, who used the sit-down strike to its fullest advantage, who sought and succeeded in stopping the machine. And it was Bayard Rustin and James Farmer, two young Negroes who were active in the Pacifist Fellowship of Reconciliation, and Rustin is still a member of the War Resisters League, who first began to use the sit-in as a device to protest against discrimination in the United States. In February 1942, 22 years ago, Farmer recommended the founding of an organization made up of both pacifists and non-pacifists, an organization committed to nonviolent action against racial discrimination, a group of people willing to use, and I quote, relentless non-cooperation, economic boycotts, and civil disobedience to fight for racial equality. The first notable sit-in took place in Chicago, and its success led to the founding of the Chicago Committee on Racial Equality, out of which CORE was born. All during the 40s and 50s, CORE was gaining followers, and I don't know if you realize that it was conducting sit-ins and freedom rides before these two words ever became a part of the American vernacular. A recent article describing the history of this radical movement stated that from the beginning, the sitters found eating places their most convenient targets. But as the movement gained momentum and the organization increased in membership, kneel-ins in segregated churches, wade-ins at segregated beaches, read-ins in segregated libraries, and even stall-ins and other forms of protest caught the imagination of the predominantly youthful followers. With the economic boom of the post-war era, in which Negroes partially shared, as I said earlier, with the emergence of African independence movements, in which some took pride, and especially with the Supreme Court decision of '54, it did seem the door was finally opening. And yet the disillusionment that resulted from the fact that changes were slow in coming seemed to trigger the massive rebellion which ricocheted around southern cities and college towns. And following the example set by CORE, new organizations emerged, including SNCC, SCLC, and others. But none arose without opposition. Opposition came from different sides. There was, and there is, the expected reaction of the militant bigots and the hate mongers. There was, and there is, that of those traditional advocates of continued segregation who claimed and perhaps believed, or wanted to believe, that Negroes were equal, though separate. Opposition came from the gradualists and moderates, too, those who said that being illegal, civil disobedience slows rather than hastens inevitable desegregation, those who contended that the movement builds more walls than bridges. Some opposition came from the headquarters of the NAACP, which, as I've suggested, had traditionally fought its battles in the courtroom, not at the candy counter, and which, while sympathetic to the aims of the young idealists, was wary of the methods they advocated. Parenthetically, it must be stated that in the last few years, the NAACP has also turned to extra-legal methods, and at times formed an uneasy coalition with CORE and other pacifist groups, best evidenced, I think, by the successful New York school boycotts of the past winter and the unsuccessful City Hall March a month ago. And I think it should also be pointed out that a détente has been reached between these civil rights groups in New York and Gross in the last 2 days, which is interesting. Finally, and most importantly, until quite recently, opposition has come from within the ranks of the Negro community itself, a community whose members hesitated to march for fear of losing their jobs or whatever status they held, including, it should be noted, many Negro teachers and college professors, especially in the South. And yet, despite the setbacks, despite the hollowness of many victories, despite the opposition from the outside and from within the Negro element, the demonstrations have, I think, in fact, brought about the most significant gains the American Negro has made. Only this movement has succeeded in arousing the white majority from its lethargy, from its failure to come to grips with the reality of racism and discrimination. The problem is not an easy one to solve. Many Negroes, indeed most, are poorly educated, are ill-trained, are unskilled, are second-class citizens, as I said. For too many, shame and self-hate prevail where pride should reign. Despair exists instead of hope. This is the legacy of the system which denied and continues to deny the majority of Negroes the opportunity to fulfill their own potentialities in the pursuit of happiness we also glibly discuss. And as long as segregation continues, the majority of America's Negro population will remain second class. They know this. And now that the revolt is at hand, it will not be quelled. There's no turning back. If the Civil Rights Bill passes today, the demonstrations will increase. If it doesn't pass, the demonstrations will increase. In the North and in the West, the situation has always been different from the South. And in many ways, it's more potentially, I think, more explosive. De facto segregation is building up in the North as rapidly as de jure segregation is being broken down in the South. The entire Negro community, not just the extremists, said one person, want immediate steps to put life in the legal paper mache that stands instead of real equality in the North. And as we've seen recently, one way or other, they're going to try to get it. In the past year, the movement has grown with such force that many who for years have been too frightened or too apathetic to speak out have been caught up in the revolutionary fervor. And it is essential to recognize that the massiveness of support has gradually but perceptively begun to change the character, the focus, and the leadership of the movement itself. I want to dwell on these 3 points briefly: the character, the focus, and the leadership of the movement itself. The character, I think, will change, or will continue to change from a movement of middle-class people seeking their slogan, freedom now, that is, equality in housing for which they can pay, access to jobs for which they're already skilled, to that of a poor people who are not ready to compete and not only know it, but know why. This change is bringing about, or will bring about, a change in focus. The movement has and must become increasingly introspective, even as militancy increases. Negritude, a term buried in the corner of dusty anthropology texts, is becoming a watchword. As pride in being a man, black or white, increases, whites are being eased and sometimes pushed out of positions of leadership to make room for those who can more closely identify with, and more importantly, be identified with, the Negro masses. But despite the profound shifts in scope and method, there appears to be a constant running through the ranks of the majority of those who lead the revolt and most of their followers. The radical tactics are being employed not to subvert the system, but to join it. And thus, the values they seek to emulate are middle-class values. Integration remains the goal. During the past few years, then, a new answer to the problem of discrimination has been offered. The Negro masses, for the first time, slowly, gradually, and now with accelerating speed, are beginning to assert themselves, beginning to act on their own, are beginning to overtly reject segregation and its requirements in order to enter the mainstream of American life. America's Negroes, in my mind, are only now becoming Negro Americans, hyphenates, as some sociologists would call them. And as a result of the boycotts and demonstrations in the North and South, Negroes across the nation are for the first time developing that sufficient cohesion that I spoke of in the introduction, that sufficient cohesion necessary to engage in extended action directed toward political ends. And we must recognize that as every victory brings them closer to total victory, as every defeat heightens the desire to upset the status quo, they will be increasingly attracted to proposals which involve a radical break with the past. Measures designed merely to assuage the guilt of those who maintain the patterns of segregation are simply no longer acceptable. They do not want to remain forever below and forever beyond the pale of acceptability. They do not want to remain forever separated by the barrier of caste. And one by one, the sacred institutions of society are becoming targets. The schools, the churches, the factories, neighborhoods themselves. Even the glittery World's Fair, which is viewed by many as an anachronism in the same city pockmarked by squalor and segregation, has come under attack. Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man is coming out into the open. And many middle-class individuals, white ones and Negro ones too for that matter, are confounded by his militance, by the shrillness of the protest, by the sharpness of the demands. Jules Feiffer, one of my favorite cartoonists, summed up the feeling of many of these frightened and bewildered people, the gentle people who talked so long and did so little about segregation. One of his cartoon characters says, Silberman reports this in his book, "Civil rights used to be so much more tolerable until the Negroes got into it." This is bitter humor, but for too many so-called liberals, it's true. The once apathetic, now anxious white community has been rudely awakened to reality. The Negro community is desperately trying to say goodbye to Uncle Tom forever. It would be fitting, I suppose, to end my remarks on the social consequences of discrimination or reactions to discrimination on a note of triumph, with visions of a new world a-coming, waving the flag and so forth. For the present, I can't. We live in a racist society where color counts, where prejudice and discrimination are widespread, where immeasurable damage has been done to Negroes, damage for which both Negroes and whites must now pay a price. And I think only a clear appreciation of these facts of life will help to bring an end to racism and a better life for those minority group members who suffer the stigma of having been born brown or black in a white man's country. Thank you.